The courtroom was silent. All eyes were fixed on Officer James Walker, a man who had once been hailed as a hero. He stood in front of the judge, his hands shackled, his head bowed in defeat. His face, once full of pride, now showed only exhaustion and despair. The final verdict had been read. Guilty. The charges of murder and corruption had been leveled against him, but James knew deep in his heart that he was innocent. The evidence, the testimonies, the fingerprints, they had all been planted to frame him. Yet, here he was, convicted of a crime he did not commit. His world had crumbled. But it wasn't the verdict that shocked everyone. It was what happened next. As the bailiff began to escort him out of the courtroom, James stopped in his tracks. He turned toward his wife, Emily, who sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. With a voice filled with emotion, he begged, "Please, just one last hug. I need to feel your arms around me." Everyone in the courtroom was stunned. The guards froze. The judge, the prosecutor, and even the defense lawyer were all caught off guard by the officer's sudden plea. Emily stood up, her heart racing. She hadn't spoken a word throughout the trial, but now she stepped forward, trembling. The guards looked to the judge, unsure of what to do. The judge's gavel struck the bench, and the courtroom remained in a hushed silence. What would happen next? Was this the last time Emily would ever see her husband? The tension was unbearable. The air was thick with uncertainty. What happened next would change everything. But the question on everyone's mind was, could James ever prove his innocence before it was too late? The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. James Walker had always been known as a reliable cop, a man who would never back down from doing what was right. He had been part of the force for over 15 years, earning numerous awards and commendations for his bravery. He had put his life on the line countless times to protect the people of New York, and everyone around him had trusted him, until that fateful night. It had started like any other night. James had been on his regular patrol in a quiet neighborhood, checking on local businesses and keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. It was around 2:30 a.m. when he got the call about a robbery at a nearby jewelry store. He rushed to the scene, his sirens blaring as he sped through the empty streets. When he arrived, the door to the store was wide open, but there was no sign of forced entry. It was odd, but he didn't hesitate. He entered cautiously, his gun drawn. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Suddenly, he heard a noise from the back room, a metallic clink, like something heavy being dropped. He rushed to investigate, and as he turned the corner, he found himself face to face with a figure holding a gun. The figure fired, and James instinctively shot back, hitting the man in the chest. The man collapsed immediately, but that wasn't the worst part. As James approached the fallen figure, he recognized him. It was another officer, a fellow cop named Mike Reynolds. Mike had been with the force for only a few years, but they had worked together on a few cases. James had never imagined that his colleague could be involved in anything criminal. Mike had been a good guy, at least, that's what James had thought. James checked Mike's pulse, but it was too late. Mike was dead. That was when everything fell apart. The investigation into Mike's death was swift and relentless. James had tried to explain that it had been a mistake, self-defense, but no one believed him. The evidence seemed stacked against him. The gun he had used was found at the scene with his fingerprints all over it. His partner, Officer Sarah Lewis, testified that she had seen James leave the scene that night. The security cameras at the store showed James entering, but there was no footage of him leaving. As days turned into weeks, James's world became a nightmare. He was suspended from the force and placed under investigation. Then came the arrest. He had been charged with the murder of Mike Reynolds and the theft of several items from the jewelry store, a crime he did not commit. The whispers started. People who once called him a hero now questioned his integrity. His colleagues began to avoid him, and the support he once had vanished. The entire department turned their back on him. The trial was even worse. The prosecutor painted a picture of James as a corrupt officer who had been secretly involved in illegal activities. They brought in false witnesses who testified against him, claiming they had seen him take bribes. It was all a lie, but no one was listening. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict. James sat in the courtroom, numb. The world had turned against him, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The only person who had stuck by him through it all was his wife, Emily. She had believed in him from the very beginning, despite the overwhelming evidence and the public outcry. Emily's unwavering support had been his lifeline during the darkest days of the trial, but now, it seemed as though he was going to lose everything. As the judge announced his sentence, James's heart sank. He would be serving 25 years to life in prison for a crime he did not commit. His future was uncertain, and the world outside the courtroom would move on without him. But in that moment, all James could think about was his wife. Emily had been there for him through it all, but now, he might never see her again. And then, in a desperate act, James had made that one last plea. Please, just one last hug. The courtroom was still in chaos. Everyone was staring, unsure of what to do. Emily had made it to the front, her eyes wide with disbelief. The guards remained frozen in place, unsure of whether they should allow the moment of tenderness. The judge cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. Officer Walker, I understand the pain you're feeling, but we cannot allow this request, the judge said sternly. You are under arrest for the murder of Officer Reynolds, and I must insist that you be taken into custody immediately. James's heart raced. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not like this. His hand was still outstretched toward Emily, his face filled with desperation. Please, he whispered, almost pleading. Just one more hug. Emily looked at him, tears falling freely down her cheeks. She was torn between the desire to run to him and the cold, harsh reality that this might be the last time she ever saw her husband. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. Would she reach him in time? Would the court allow the final, desperate plea of a man who had lost everything? Everyone in the courtroom was waiting for the answer, and it was unclear what would happen next. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Time seemed to stretch out as James's outstretched hand hovered between hope and despair. His pleading eyes locked with Emily's, and for a moment, the world outside the courtroom ceased to exist. All that mattered was that single moment, the one last chance to hold on to the love they shared. But the guards remained motionless. Emily was just a few steps away from him, her face a mixture of sorrow and determination. She had already lost so much, her trust in the system, her husband's dignity, and now, she was about to lose him completely. Please, James whispered again, his voice breaking. Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. She reached out slowly, as if afraid this moment might slip away from her before she could grasp it. The guards looked between the judge and the two of them, uncertain. Finally, one of the guards nodded toward the judge, who gave a barely perceptible sigh. Let them, the judge said quietly, breaking the silence. But this is the last time, Officer Walker. The guards took a hesitant step back, and in that instant, Emily rushed into James's arms. She held him tight, as if afraid that letting go would cause him to disappear forever. James closed his eyes, his arms trembling as he wrapped them around her. For a moment, they stood there, locked in an embrace that spoke volumes. An embrace that was filled with love, pain, and an overwhelming sense of loss. But as the seconds ticked by, reality began to seep back in. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of their brief moment of solace. The guards cleared their throats, reminding them that time was running out. Slowly, Emily pulled away, her tears staining James's shirt. They looked at each other, both knowing that this might be their last shared moment for a long time. The courtroom, still in shock from what had just happened, began to stir as the guards stepped forward. James was about to be taken away, his sentence awaiting him. Emily's eyes were red, but there was a spark of something else in them, determination. As the guards moved to restrain him again, Emily spoke, her voice shaking but firm. I will not stop fighting for you, James. This isn't the end. James nodded, his face a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. You don't have to. I know you'll fight. You always have. And then, with one last, lingering glance, they were separated. James was led away, his hands still shackled, and Emily was left standing alone in the middle of the courtroom, her heart broken but resolute. The days that followed felt like a blur for Emily. The courtroom had been her last glimpse of James for what seemed like an eternity. She had promised to fight, but now she was faced with a daunting challenge. Where could she begin? How could she prove her husband's innocence when the entire system seemed stacked against him? She returned to their small apartment, the place that had once been filled with laughter and love, now eerily quiet and cold. She could still feel the warmth of James's presence in the corners of the room, but it was fading, just like everything else. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she picked up a pile of papers. The trial transcripts, the evidence reports, and the countless articles from the news outlets that had already written him off as a guilty man. Emily couldn't accept it. She knew her husband. She had loved him for years, and she knew in her heart that he was not capable of the crime he had been accused of. But how could she convince the world of that? How could she get anyone to listen? It wasn't just the system that was broken. It was the very people who had betrayed James. Officer Sarah Lewis, once a close colleague, had testified against him. Emily couldn't understand it. Sarah had always seemed so loyal, so dedicated to the job. And yet, there she was, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, her words condemning James to a life behind bars. Was she lying? Or was she just too afraid to stand up to the real criminals? As Emily thought about all of this, a single thought gnawed at the back of her mind. Someone was responsible for framing James. Someone was behind it all, pulling the strings to make sure he was taken down. But who? Across town, in a small, dimly lit office, Detective Mark Simmons sat hunched over his desk, staring at a computer screen. The case of Officer James Walker had caught his attention, not because he was involved in the investigation, but because something didn't sit right with him. Mark had been working the case of Mike Reynolds' death from the start, and as he read through the reports again, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entire thing was staged. The evidence against James was solid, or so it seemed, but something about the way everything lined up felt too convenient, too perfect. There were gaps in the timeline, missing pieces of information, and contradictions in witness statements. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure James was blamed. Mark's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Could it be that James was being framed by someone within the department? Could someone be trying to take him down for reasons that had nothing to do with the crime itself? Mark had always prided himself on his instincts. He had a reputation for solving the toughest cases, and he had learned to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him that there was more to this case than met the eye. He leaned back in his chair and picked up the phone. He wasn't supposed to be investigating the case, but he knew that if he didn't do something soon, an innocent man would be condemned for a crime he didn't commit. "I need to speak with Emily Walker," he muttered to himself, dialing the number. Back at the courthouse, the whispers had already begun. People were talking about James Walker, the cop who had been wrongfully convicted, but not everyone believed the narrative. Some people still held on to the hope that the truth would come out, that James would be exonerated and his name cleared. But others had already made up their minds. They believed the evidence. They believed the testimonies. And most of all, they believed that Officer James Walker was guilty. Emily's resolve hardened as she continued to sift through the evidence. She wasn't going to let her husband rot in prison, not when she knew he was innocent. She would find the truth, no matter how long it took. And with Mark's unexpected phone call, Emily began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. But before she could say anything, Mark's voice cut through the silence. "I need you to trust me, Emily. I'm not giving up on this case. We'll find out who did this." And that's when Emily realized this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The days following Mark's call were filled with a sense of unease, but also a flicker of hope. Emily had known, deep down, that there were forces working against her husband, but she never imagined that someone like Mark Simmons would step forward to help her. He wasn't a part of the official investigation, and he certainly wasn't obligated to get involved in James's case. Yet, here he was, offering a lifeline in a sea of doubt. Mark had been a detective for over a decade, with a reputation for getting to the bottom of even the most complex cases. Emily had never met him before, but there was something about his voice, steady, confident, and sincere, that made her believe he might actually be able to help. After all, Mark had an insider's perspective. He knew the inner workings of the department, and he had been one of the first to investigate Mike Reynolds' death. For now, Emily couldn't afford to hesitate. She needed every advantage she could get. The first thing Mark had advised her to do was to meet in person, away from the prying eyes of the media and anyone who might be trying to sabotage the case further. She agreed without a second thought. Emily arrived at a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city, the type of place where no one would ask too many questions. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and she quickly spotted Mark sitting at a corner booth, his face partially obscured by a newspaper. He looked up when she approached, a faint smile on his face, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "Emily," he greeted her, standing up to shake her hand. "Thanks for meeting me." She sat down across from him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't know what to say. I can't even wrap my mind around what's happening. My husband is locked away, and no one believes he's innocent. How do we even begin?" Mark leaned back in his seat, folding the newspaper. "The first thing we need to do is find out who's really behind all of this. Someone wanted James convicted, and they went through great lengths to make it happen. But the question is, why?" Emily's brow furrowed. "You think it's not just a random act? That there's something bigger going on?" "I don't think anything about this case is random," Mark replied, his voice serious. "There are too many inconsistencies. The evidence is too perfect, too carefully planted. Someone wanted to make sure James was taken down. And I think it's someone within the department." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Could it be true? Could someone she knew, someone James trusted, have been involved in framing him? The thought was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't dismiss it. "Do you have any leads?" she asked, trying to steady her nerves. Mark nodded. "I've been going through the trial transcripts, talking to people, and doing some digging behind the scenes. It's still early, but there are a few things that stand out. We need to look more closely at Officer Sarah Lewis. She's the one who testified against James, and her story doesn't quite add up." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah had been one of James's closest friends on the force. They had worked together on multiple cases, and Emily had always trusted her. But now, everything about Sarah felt suspect. Mark leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "I'm not saying she's directly involved, but she might know more than she's letting on. We need to figure out why she turned on James." Later that evening, Emily couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the conversation with Mark. Sarah's testimony against James had been a major blow, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about it. Why would Sarah, someone who had been a trusted colleague and friend, lie under oath? What could have convinced her to betray James so completely? Emily knew that finding the truth was the only way to clear James's name. But where did she even begin? She had no connections left in the department. The people who once worked with James now saw him as a criminal, and the media had already written him off. The pressure of it all weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't give up. She had promised James she would fight for him, and she would. The following morning, Emily stood outside the prison gates. She was about to visit James for the first time since the trial, and her heart was a tangled mess of emotions. It had been a week since his conviction, and every moment without him felt like an eternity. The thought of seeing him behind bars made her stomach churn, but she knew she had to be strong for him. As she entered the visiting area, she spotted James sitting at a table, his hands clasped in front of him. His once proud demeanor was gone, replaced by the quiet resignation of a man who had been betrayed by the system he had sworn to protect. "James," Emily said softly, sitting down across from him. He looked up, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of hope crossed his face. "Emily, I knew you'd come." She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm not going to give up on you, James. I'm working with someone, a detective named Mark Simmons. He thinks we might be able to find the truth." James's eyes widened slightly. "Mark Simmons? The one who worked on Mike's case?" Emily nodded. "He's convinced someone framed you. He's been looking into it, and he believes there's more to this than meets the eye." James looked down at their joined hands, his expression troubled. "I don't know if it's enough. The whole world thinks I did it, Emily, how can we prove I didn't? Together, Emily said firmly. We'll do this together. I won't stop until I find the truth. Back in the city, Mark's investigation continued. He had made some headway in tracking down people who might have information, but nothing concrete had come up yet. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. There were people in the department who didn't want the truth to come out, people who had too much to lose if the case against James unraveled. Mark was starting to get the sense that he was being watched. Small, subtle signs. Someone tailing him, odd phone calls, and even the occasional strange figure lurking in the shadows. Whoever was behind this case didn't want him digging any deeper, and it made Mark more determined than ever to uncover the truth. But as he continued his search, something unexpected happened. He received a phone call, one that would change the course of the investigation. Mark Simmons? A voice on the other end asked, barely audible. I have information, but you need to meet me alone. Mark sat up straight, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. The voice on the other end was shaky, yet there was an unmistakable urgency to it. I don't have much time, the voice continued. I know who's behind the framing of Officer James Walker, but you need to meet me tonight. There's a place I can trust. I'll tell you everything then. Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. His heart raced, a mix of excitement and apprehension stirring in him. This could be the break he had been waiting for, the lead that would unravel everything. But who was on the other end of the line? And why were they so insistent on meeting in person, in secret? Mark wasn't one to shy away from risky situations. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. He had seen the toll the trial had taken on James and Emily, and he couldn't let them suffer any longer. He had to find the truth. He quickly grabbed his coat, his mind racing through the possibilities. Who could have information like this? Was it someone on the inside? Or perhaps someone who had been affected by the corruption that had run rampant through the department? Either way, he couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. The meeting was set for 10 p.m. at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Mark arrived early, his car pulling into the dark lot, the headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to roll in. The warehouse was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its rusted doors barely hanging on their hinges. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, a place where no one would overhear and no one would ask questions. Mark stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting on the gun at his hip. He knew that he had to be cautious. Whoever had contacted him could be a friend or a foe, and he wasn't taking any chances. He made his way to the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark, cavernous space filled with old crates and debris. Mark Simmons, a voice called out from the shadows. The voice was low, but there was a sense of familiarity to it. Mark's eyes scanned the dimly lit warehouse, trying to locate the source of the voice. Who are you? Show yourself, he demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The figure stepped into the light, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was someone he knew, a former cop, one who had been part of the department years ago. His name was Derek Hayes, and he had been dismissed after a scandal involving bribery and corruption. Mark had heard rumors about Derek's involvement in the underworld, but he had never been able to prove anything. Derek's eyes narrowed as he looked at Mark, his face hardened by years of hard living. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, he said with a smirk. What do you want, Derek? Mark asked, his hand still resting on his gun. Why contact me now? Derek chuckled, his voice gravelly. Because you're the only one left who cares about the truth. Everyone else has already made up their minds about James. They've all turned their backs on him, just like they did to me. Mark frowned. What are you talking about? You're the last person I'd expect to help me. Derek stepped closer, his eyes scanning the shadows. I didn't get involved because I wanted to. I got involved because I had no choice. The same people who framed James for Mike's death, they're the same ones who had me silenced all those years ago. The difference is, I'm still breathing. Mark's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, but it also made him nervous. Derek wasn't known for being trustworthy, and he had his own reasons for wanting revenge. Mark had to be careful. What do you know about the case? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. I know everything, Derek said, his voice suddenly low and serious. It was all a setup. The evidence, the testimony, the witnesses, they were all paid off. James never killed Mike. Someone else did. And I know exactly who it was. Mark's heart raced. Who? Derek's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I'm not just going to hand it to you, Simmons. I've been waiting years for this moment. If you want to know the truth, you're going to have to work for it. Meanwhile, back at the prison, Emily was growing increasingly frustrated. It had been days since she had spoken with Mark, and she hadn't received any new information. She had tried calling him multiple times, but he had yet to return her calls. She knew he was working hard, but the uncertainty was starting to take its toll. Emily stood in the visitation room, staring at the phone in her hand. She had just finished another call with James, his voice filled with the same hopelessness that had crept into his words every time they spoke. He was starting to lose faith, and she couldn't blame him. The days in prison were long, and the walls felt like they were closing in on him. Just as she was about to hang up, her phone buzzed. A new message. It was from Mark. I've got a lead. Meet me tomorrow night. Same place. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Finally, something to hold on to. She quickly typed a reply, telling Mark that she'd be there. She couldn't waste any time. If they were going to clear James's name, they needed to act fast. But as she put her phone back into her purse, a new thought crossed her mind. Derek Hayes. She had heard rumors about him over the years, rumors about his connections to shady figures and his fall from grace within the department. Was he the one Mark was meeting? Was he the source of this mysterious new information? Emily didn't have time to figure it out. She knew that she had to trust Mark, even if she didn't fully understand the situation. Tomorrow night would be critical. Back at the warehouse, Derek's cryptic words still echoed in Mark's mind. He had learned a lot in his career, but there was something about this case that didn't add up. Derek's involvement made things murkier than ever. But if Derek had the answers, Mark couldn't afford to ignore him. What do you want from me, Derek? Mark pressed, trying to keep the conversation on track. What's the next step? Derek's eyes gleamed with something close to satisfaction. The next step is to gather the evidence. You're going to have to get your hands dirty, Simmons. But if you do this right, you'll have everything you need to take them down. And if you don't, well, then you'll be just another part of the system. Mark didn't like the sound of that, but he had no choice. He was already too deep into this. He had to see it through. I'll do what it takes, Mark said, his voice resolute. But I'm warning you, Derek. If this is a setup, Derek raised a hand, cutting him off. It's not. But if you don't follow through, you'll be the one to regret it. As the two men stood in the dark warehouse, Mark knew that the road ahead was going to be dangerous. He had to walk a fine line between trusting Derek and making sure he wasn't being led into a trap. But one thing was for sure. James's innocence was within reach, and Mark was going to do whatever it took to find the truth. The following day felt like an eternity for both Emily and Mark. The uncertainty of the previous evening's meeting with Derek Hayes weighed heavily on Mark's mind. He had barely slept, replaying every word Derek had said. His instincts told him to be cautious, but there was something undeniable in Derek's words, a knowledge of the inner workings of the department, the kind of information Mark couldn't ignore. Emily, on the other hand, spent her day distracted, unable to focus on anything except the looming meeting with Mark. She knew that tonight might be their best chance to get closer to the truth about what really happened the night Mike Reynolds died. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they were still missing key fragments, and tonight might be the moment when they finally had a complete picture. As evening approached, Mark checked his phone once again to confirm the time and location of the meeting. It was set for 10 p.m. at the same warehouse on the outskirts of town. He felt a twinge of unease in his gut, but he pushed it aside. The truth was worth the risk. He grabbed his jacket, took a deep breath, and left his apartment, knowing this was his only chance to help Emily and, more importantly, James. At the same time, Emily stood before her mirror, trying to steady her nerves. She had already prepared herself mentally, but tonight felt different. It wasn't just a simple meeting. It was a chance to prove her husband's innocence, to clear his name and set things right. The enormity of what they were about to do hit her all at once. She had spent years supporting James, believing in him even when no one else did. Now, it was time to take action. She put on her jacket and grabbed her purse. As she stepped out of her apartment, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mark. "I'll be there. Are you ready?" She quickly typed a reply. "Yes, I'll meet you there." Her heart was pounding in her chest as she headed for the car. The drive to the warehouse felt like the longest one she had ever made. The road seemed quieter than usual, and the distant city lights blurred in the rearview mirror as she focused on the road ahead. She could feel the weight of the moment. Everything had led up to this night, and she couldn't afford to fail now. By the time Emily arrived, Mark was already there. His car was parked nearby, and he was standing by the entrance of the warehouse, scanning the area for any signs of danger. When he saw Emily, he quickly walked toward her. "You're here," Mark said, his voice low. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up." Emily didn't hesitate. "I'm here to help. What's the plan?" Mark's eyes narrowed slightly as he took a deep breath. "We're about to meet Derek again. I don't trust him fully, but he knows something. If we can just get him to give us the rest of the information, we can finally expose who's behind this. But we need to be careful. If he's lying, we'll be walking straight into a trap." Emily nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. "I don't care what it takes. I won't stop until James is free." They made their way inside the dark, empty warehouse. The atmosphere felt thick with tension, the kind of quiet that only came before something big. Mark scanned the area, his eyes moving from shadow to shadow, making sure they weren't being followed. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, checking the time. It was nearly 10:15 p.m. "We're late," Emily murmured. "Derek said he would be here at 10. Mark glanced at his watch, then at the empty space around them. "He's here. Just stay sharp." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. It was Derek Hayes. He moved with a casual confidence, as if he weren't meeting two people who were, essentially, his only lifeline. "Thought you'd never make it," Derek's voice rang out, a bit too relaxed for Mark's taste. "I figured you'd be more hesitant to trust me." "I don't trust you, Derek," Mark said bluntly, his eyes narrowing. "But I don't have a choice. If you want to help James, you'd better start talking." Derek chuckled, a dry sound. "Straight to the point. Huh? Fine. Let's get to it. I've been in this game too long to waste time with niceties. You want to know who framed James Walker? It wasn't just anyone. It was someone with power. Someone who could pull the strings." Mark stepped closer, his voice firm. "Who, Derek?" Derek hesitated, looking around the room. For a moment, Mark thought he might refuse to speak, but then Derek finally spoke. "It was Chief Robert Moore," Derek said quietly, his eyes locking onto Mark's. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Chief Moore," she whispered. "But why? Why would he frame James?" Derek looked at her, his face hardening. "You don't know what kind of man Moore is. He's dirty, always has been." When Mike Reynolds stumbled onto something he shouldn't have, something big, he was silenced. But not before he left a trail. James was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Moore knew Mike was a liability, and when James showed up at the scene of Mike's death, Moore saw his chance. He framed him to cover up his own tracks. Mark shook his head in disbelief. "So Moore killed Mike and framed James to protect himself?" Derek nodded. "Exactly. And there's more. Moore's been involved in a lot of shady deals. I've seen it all, but no one's been willing to step forward. James was the perfect scapegoat. The department's been covering for him for years." Emily's mind raced. This was the lead they needed. But Derek's words raised even more questions. How deep did Moore's corruption run? Who else in the department was complicit? And how could they prove it? "We need to go public with this," Emily said, her voice trembling with both anger and hope. Derek's face darkened. "You don't get it, do you? Moore is untouchable. If you go public with this, you'll be putting yourself in the line of fire. And James? He'll never see the light of day again." Emily's heart sank. Derek was right. Moore was powerful, and the risks were enormous. But she had already made up her mind. If they didn't act now, they would lose their chance to clear James's name forever. "Then we take him down the only way we can," Mark said firmly. "We gather evidence. We build a case. We expose Moore for what he is." But Derek wasn't done. You'll need more than just evidence, he warned. Moore has friends in high places. If you're serious about this, you'll need to be prepared for a fight. A big one. Mark and Emily exchanged a look, their resolve strengthening. They were in this together, and they weren't backing down. We're ready, Mark said. We'll do whatever it takes. The weight of Derek's words lingered in the air, thick with the promise of danger. Emily's heart raced as the enormity of their task hit her with full force. The game had just changed. What they were about to take on wasn't just about clearing James's name. It was about exposing the rot at the very core of the department. A department that was supposed to uphold the law, but had become a machine for corruption, deceit, and power. And at the center of it all was Chief Robert Moore. But as the adrenaline pumped through Emily's veins, so did a new sense of determination. She had already lost so much, her trust in the system, the man she loved, and now her sense of security. There was no turning back. Mark, on the other hand, stood silent, his mind working over the plan. They couldn't just rush into this blindly. They needed a strategy. They needed proof, hard evidence that could tear Moore's empire down. If they failed, they could all end up behind bars, or worse. Derek's smirk never faltered as he watched them process the information. He knew what it would take to bring Moore down, and he also knew the dangers that awaited them. You want proof? Derek's voice interrupted the silence. I can get you some, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be clean. Mark's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. I've got connections. People who've seen Moore in action. People who know where the bodies are buried. But it's going to cost. And I don't just mean money. I mean trust. If you're serious, you'll have to do what I say when I say it. No second guessing. Mark looked at Emily, then back at Derek. We're in. Back at the apartment, Emily could barely sit still. The walls of the tiny room felt like they were closing in on her. She paced back and forth, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had been so focused on James's trial that she hadn't even thought about the depth of the corruption in the department. Moore wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was the head of it all. And if Derek was right, Moore's network was vast. He had allies in every corner, from the precinct to the city's upper echelons. No one could be trusted, and everyone could be a potential threat. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her pulse quickened, and she froze for a moment before walking slowly toward it. Who could it be? Was it someone from the department? Or worse, someone from Moore's camp? She opened the door cautiously, her eyes scanning the hallway. Standing there was Mark, his expression grim. Everything okay? Emily asked, though she could see the tension in his posture. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. We've got a problem. What is it? Emily asked, her stomach sinking. It's Derek, Mark said, his voice low. I've been thinking about what he said. We can't just blindly trust him. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. You don't think he's playing us? Mark shook his head. I'm not sure, but I don't like how fast he's willing to go along with everything. He's got his own agenda, Emily. I can feel it. We need to tread carefully. Emily's mind raced. Mark was right. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes, not now. They had to stay focused on their goal, but they also needed to make sure Derek wasn't manipulating them for his own gain. Then we need to be smart about this, Emily said, her voice steady. We take the information he gives us, but we don't take everything at face value. If he's hiding something, we'll find out. Mark nodded. Agreed. We'll use him, but we'll also have a backup plan in case this blows up in our faces. Later that night, Mark and Emily met with Derek again, this time at a less conspicuous location, a small cafe in a quiet part of the city. Derek was already there when they arrived, sitting at a corner booth, his expression unreadable. As they sat down, he slid a folder across the table toward them. Here, Derek said, his voice low. This is what you need to start with. It's not everything, but it's a start. Mark opened the folder and quickly scanned the documents inside. They were photos, grainy, but unmistakable, of Chief Moore meeting with several known criminals. There were images of money exchanging hands, and others showing Moore in heated conversations with individuals who were notorious for their ties to organized crime. The most damning photo, however, Was one of Moore's standing in a warehouse with Mike Reynolds, the same warehouse where Mike had been killed? The look on Moore's face was one of rage, while Mike appeared to be pleading with him. "This is huge," Mark said, his voice low. "This could bring Moore down, but we'll need more. We need a direct connection to Mike's murder." Derek smiled, but there was a coldness to it. "That's where you come in. I've already set up a meeting with someone who has the rest of the information you need. Someone who was there the night Mike was killed. But be careful, this person won't just hand it over. They'll want something in return." Mark exchanged a glance with Emily. "What kind of something?" Derek leaned in, lowering his voice even further. "That's for you to figure out. But trust me, if you want the truth, you'll have to make a deal." The next day, Mark and Emily met again, this time at Emily's apartment, where they began to strategize. They knew that getting to the bottom of Mike's death was their best chance to clear James's name, but every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a web of corruption. With Moore's influence reaching far beyond the department, Mark and Emily knew that they were playing a dangerous game. Emily's phone buzzed, breaking the tension in the room. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Derek. "Meet me at the old docks. Tonight. Be ready to make a deal." Mark looked at her. "We're going. But we'll be cautious. We don't know what kind of game Derek's playing, but we need that final piece of the puzzle." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Tonight, we take the next step. This ends now." As night fell, they drove toward the docks, the air growing colder as they neared their destination. The dockyards were abandoned, with only the faint sound of water slapping against the piers. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, but also a perfect place for an ambush. Mark parked the car a few blocks away, and the two of them made their way on foot. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of their decision was bearing down on them. They reached the meeting spot, an old warehouse at the edge of the docks. The door was slightly ajar, and they stepped inside cautiously, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Derek was already there, standing in the shadows, his face hidden. "Are you ready?" Derek asked, his voice like a whisper in the dark. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance. "We're ready," Mark said, his voice steady despite the tension. But as they approached Derek, a sudden realization hit Emily. The air was too still, too quiet. Something didn't feel right. Before she could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, followed by a harsh voice. "You shouldn't have come." The voice came from behind them, cold, menacing, and unmistakable. Emily's blood ran cold as she turned to face the figure that had just stepped into the dim light of the warehouse. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Chief Moore," Mark muttered under his breath. He had known something was off about this meeting, but he hadn't expected this. They were supposed to meet Derek, not the very man they had been trying to bring down. Moore stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his loyal officers, their faces hard and expressionless. His presence was commanding, as if the entire room shrunk in his wake. He wasn't just the head of the department. He was the puppet master pulling all the strings, and now they were in his web. "Did you really think you could take me down?" Moore's voice was smooth, almost mockingly calm. "I have eyes everywhere, Simmons. I've known about your little investigation from the start. And you, Emily Walker, you should have stayed away from this. Your husband is guilty. And now, you're tangled up in something you'll never escape from." Mark stepped forward, his jaw clenched, but his voice was steady. "You won't get away with this, Moore. We have the evidence. You're done." Moore's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Evidence? You think a few photos and some old documents will bring me down? You don't know who you're dealing with. I run this city. You're nothing but ants trying to knock over my house. And Derek here." He motioned toward the shadowed figure of Derek Hayes. "He's nothing more than a pawn." Emily's head spun. Derek had betrayed them. They had trusted him, believed he was leading them toward the truth. But now it was clear that he had been working for Moore all along. Her stomach churned with anger and disbelief. "Derek," Emily spat, her voice shaking with betrayal. "You set us up?" Derek didn't answer. He just stood there, his face hidden in the shadows, his stance unreadable. But the silence spoke volumes. He had sold them out. "I thought you might be smarter than this," Moore continued, his gaze flicking between Mark and Emily. but I suppose I overestimated you both. Now, you'll both pay the price for your little crusade." Mark's mind raced. They were trapped. Moore had them cornered, and Derek had been the perfect mole, feeding them false information and leading them straight into the lion's den. It was a setup, plain and simple. He had walked right into Moore's hands. But even with the odds stacked against them, Mark wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way out. "You can't do this," Mark said, trying to buy time, his mind scrambling for any possible escape. "You're not untouchable, Moore. You might have your officers, but you won't last forever. The truth always comes out." Moore's laugh echoed in the cavernous space. "The truth? You think anyone's going to believe you? You think anyone cares about one rogue cop in a sea of corruption? I'm the law here, Simmons. And you?" He looked at Emily, his gaze hardening. "You're just another casualty of a war you don't understand." Emily's fists clenched. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let Moore win, not after everything they had fought for. She looked at Mark, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. There had to be a way. They couldn't go down without a fight. "We're not going down without a fight," she said, her voice low but resolute. Mark nodded. "We're going to take you down, Moore. One way or another." Moore's smile faded, replaced with a hard, calculating expression. "You really think you can make a difference? You think anyone will listen to you after I'm through with you? I'm going to make sure both of you disappear. And then, I'll bury your precious Officer Walker for good." The two officers behind Moore moved toward Emily and Mark, their hands resting on their weapons. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension, and every muscle in Mark's body was screaming for action. Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. The noise cut through the charged atmosphere, and for a split second, it distracted Moore. He glanced at her phone, his eyes narrowing. Emily's heart raced. She didn't know who was texting her, but she didn't have time to check. She just hoped it was something, anything, that could give them a chance. Mark saw the brief flicker of distraction in Moore's eyes and knew this was their moment. Without hesitation, he grabbed Emily's arm and yanked her behind a stack of crates. The officers reached for their guns, but it was too late. Mark fired a quick shot at the light switch across the room, plunging the warehouse into darkness. The sudden blackout sent the room into chaos. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she felt Mark pulling her toward the back door, both of them moving as quietly and quickly as possible. They had no time to waste. It was now or never. As they reached the door, Emily glanced back one last time, her gaze locking onto Derek. He was still standing in the shadows, his face unreadable. The guilt weighed heavily on her. But there was no time for regret. They had to keep moving. Mark flung the door open, and they ran into the night, the cold air hitting their faces as they made their escape. Behind them, they could hear Moore's angry voice shouting orders, but they didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. By the time they reached the car, Emily's legs were aching, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Mark threw the keys to her, and she quickly got into the driver's seat. They couldn't afford to stop now. They had just narrowly escaped Moore's clutches, but the danger was far from over. Mark's mind raced as he stared out the window. They had the evidence, proof of Moore's corruption, but now they had to figure out what to do with it. The police department was compromised. Moore had too much power. Who could they trust? "There's one person," Mark muttered, his eyes narrowing as a thought occurred to him. "One person who might be able to help." Emily glanced at him, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Who?" "The media," Mark said. "We go public. We leak the evidence. Show the world who Moore really is." Emily's stomach churned. The media could help them, but it was risky. Moore had enough influence to silence anyone who got in his way. But they had no other choice. "We have to do it," Emily said firmly. "It's the only way." The car sped through the streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the way forward. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing as she processed everything that had happened in the past few hours. They had barely escaped Moore's grasp, but they still had the evidence they needed. But as Mark had said, their work wasn't over yet. They needed to take this to the public, and fast. As the car turned onto a quieter street, Mark sat back, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. They had no idea if Moore had already sent people after them, But he knew one thing for certain. If they didn't act quickly, everything they had risked so far would be for nothing. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping both of them out of their thoughts. She reached for it, but before she could look, Mark's eyes widened. "Don't check it yet," he said quickly, his voice tense. "It could be a trap." Emily hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. But the instinct to check it was overwhelming. She had already been through so much, and now that they had a fighting chance, the idea of being one step ahead of Moore felt almost too good to be true. She couldn't risk it, though. It might be a message from Moore's team, or worse, Derek, letting them believe they were safe, just to get them in another trap. After a brief moment, Emily lowered her phone, her face grim. "We're not stopping, then?" Mark looked at her. His face darkened with the weight of the decision. "We can't afford to stop. Not until we get this to the right people." Their destination was a small, independent news station, one that had made a name for itself by uncovering corruption in high places. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. If they could get the evidence to the right journalist, they might have a chance to expose Moore once and for all. As they arrived at the station, the door to the building was locked, the dim light of the front desk flickering through the glass. Emily parked the car, and both of them quickly made their way inside. The lobby was eerily quiet, and the receptionist at the front desk gave them an uninterested glance before returning to his computer. Emily stepped up, her voice urgent but controlled. "We need to speak to Rachel West immediately. She's the lead investigative reporter, right?" The receptionist hesitated for a moment, eyeing them both suspiciously. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "You'll have to wait. She's in the back." "But, what's this about?" Mark stepped forward, speaking with authority. "It's about corruption in the police department. We have evidence that could bring down the head of the department." The receptionist's eyes widened, and he gestured to the hallway. "Right down there. But hurry." They didn't waste time. Mark and Emily rushed down the hall to the back office, where they found Rachel West hunched over a desk, surrounded by papers. Her sharp eyes turned toward them as they entered. "Rachel West?" Mark asked, his voice urgent. "We have something for you." Rachel looked them both over, sizing them up. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and quick judgment. It was clear she wasn't easily impressed, but she knew when to listen. "Who are you, and what do you have for me?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. Mark took a deep breath and pulled out the folder containing the photos and documents they had gathered, placing it on the desk. He opened it slowly, making sure Rachel saw the full extent of the evidence. "This is a list of proof we've collected. Photos of the chief, illegal dealings with criminals, and evidence that ties him directly to the death of Officer Mike Reynolds." Rachel's eyes flicked over the documents quickly, her face unreadable. Then she met their gaze. This is explosive," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and caution. "You're telling me that the head of the department is involved in all of this?" Emily nodded, her voice tight with emotion. "Yes, and we're not just talking about one murder. Moore's been involved in countless illegal activities. If this gets out, he'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one believes us." Rachel's face grew more serious. "You're right. This kind of story isn't just going to get picked up by anyone. We're talking about the highest levels of corruption. This won't just bring Moore down. It'll bring the whole department down with him." Mark leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Then do it. Get it out. We don't care about the consequences. Just make sure Moore is exposed." Rachel glanced down at the folder again, her fingers tracing the edge of the photos. She didn't immediately respond, her mind clearly working through the implications of everything they had just shared. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I'll need to verify this," she said, looking up at them. "You can't just release something this big without checking every last detail. But if it's as solid as you say it is, I'll make sure the world hears about it." Mark didn't hesitate. "How long do you need?" Rachel thought for a moment, then stood up, grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll get my team on it. It's going to take a few hours, but I'll work as fast as I can. We need to get ahead of Moore, or he's going to try to erase all of this." The next few hours felt like a blur. Emily and Mark waited in the lobby of the station, the minutes dragging by as they nervously watched the clock. They knew the clock was ticking. Moore was undoubtedly trying to track them down, and they couldn't afford to be caught. The longer it took for Rachel to verify the information, the greater the risk that Moore would catch up to them. Around midnight, Rachel returned. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were alight with something else: determination. "We've cross-referenced everything. The photos, the documents, everything. It all checks out. I've already contacted my editor. We're going to run the story tomorrow morning. Front page." A wave of relief washed over Emily. "You mean it? It's happening?" Rachel nodded, her voice firm. "It's happening. But we're going to need more than just a few copies of evidence. If we're going to expose more, we need full public support. You'll need to speak out. The story won't have the weight it needs unless we have an insider's testimony." Mark's mind raced. They had come so far. But now, there was a new obstacle to overcome. They needed to do more than just expose Moore. They needed to testify publicly, face the full force of the department, and make sure everyone saw the truth. "We'll do it," Emily said, her voice steady. "We'll testify. We won't stop now." The next morning, the city was buzzing. News stations, social media platforms, and coffee shops were all abuzz with the story that had just broken. The story of Chief Robert Moore's extensive corruption, his involvement in criminal dealings, and the cold-blooded murder of Officer Mike Reynolds. It was a story that shook the foundations of the police department and the city's political structure to its core. The world now knew what Emily and Mark had uncovered, and they weren't backing down. Emily sat in her apartment, staring at the television. The images of Moore, surrounded by police officers and politicians, his face frozen in a look of shock, were all over the news. But the real power of the story was not in the images. It was in the words. Rachel West had done more than just report on the evidence. She had also interviewed Emily and Mark, speaking directly to the public about the lengths Moore had gone to in order to cover up his crimes. It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't over yet. The phone rang on the table, snapping Emily out of her thoughts. She picked it up, her fingers still shaking from the adrenaline of the past few hours. "Hello," she answered, her voice tense. "It's Rachel," came the voice on the other end. "The media's taking the bait. The story is blowing up. But there's a new development." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened?" "We've got sources inside the department. And I just got word that Moore's already planning to strike back," Rachel replied. "You're not safe. I'm advising you both to go into hiding." Emily's chest tightened. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it aloud made the danger feel so much more real. "How much time do we have?" "A few hours at most," Rachel said. "Get out now. Don't wait. The backlash is already starting, and Moore's not going to go down quietly." Mark, who had been sitting across from Emily, listening to her half of the conversation, stood up. "She's right. We need to move. We've come too far to get caught now." They had to act fast. They couldn't risk being seen or tracked down by Moore's people. They had exposed the truth, but now they were the ones who needed to stay one step ahead. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The next few hours were a whirlwind of frantic action. Mark and Emily packed only the essentials, knowing they would need to leave the apartment as quickly as possible. Their faces were all over the news now, and anyone who had access to the media would know where to find them. They couldn't take the chance of being recognized. "Where are we going?" Emily asked as she shoved a few clothes into a duffel bag. Mark was already on the phone, arranging their next move. "I've got a friend who works in a safe house network. It's the best we can do right now. We need to lay low until we know Moore can't touch us." Emily nodded. She trusted Mark. He had always been the one with the plan. She didn't want to think about what would happen if they didn't make it out in time. The stakes had never been higher, and she couldn't afford to let fear control her now. They made their way out of the apartment, taking the back exit to avoid being seen. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as they drove through the city, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of surveillance. Every car seemed suspicious. Every person on the street seemed to be watching them. Emily's heart raced with every passing second, but she refused to show fear. They had come too far for it to end now. Hours later, they arrived at the safe house, a small, inconspicuous house on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, and the house itself looked ordinary. Nothing about it stood out. It was perfect for laying low. They were greeted by a man who introduced himself as Tom. He looked like he could have been anyone, unremarkable, yet his eyes held a depth of knowledge about the situation they were in. "Rachel sent you?" Tom asked as he led them inside. Mark nodded. "Yeah. We need a place to stay, at least for a few days. We've exposed more. Now we need to figure out our next move." Tom gestured for them to sit at the small kitchen table. "You're lucky Rachel contacted me when she did. The police department's scrambling right now. Moore's not going down without a fight, and neither is his network. If you stay here, you're safe for now, but we need to get ahead of the game." Emily sat down, her exhaustion catching up with her. The adrenaline of the past day had kept her moving, but now, with a moment of stillness, the weight of everything came crashing down. Moore's empire was vast. He had people in places she couldn't even imagine. Getting rid of him would be no small feat, but at least, for the moment, they were one step ahead. "We need to make sure Moore doesn't have anyone else on the inside," Mark said, his mind already working through their next move. "If he has people in the media, in law enforcement, we can't trust anyone." Tom nodded. "Exactly. The best thing you can do now is keep your heads down. The authorities are already investigating Moore's connections, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, we need to get more solid intel on Moore's network." Emily knew it was true. She and Mark had done everything they could to expose Moore, but they couldn't stop now. The next steps were crucial. They couldn't just go into hiding forever. They had to take action before Moore could make his next move. "We'll stay here for now," Emily said, her voice firm, "but we need to keep moving forward. We can't stop until Moore is behind bars." Mark nodded. "Agreed. But we need to make sure we have everything. We can't afford to make any mistakes." The next few days were tense. They stayed in the safe house, away from prying eyes, as the media continued to report on Moore's crimes. The pressure was mounting, and the story was gaining momentum. Emily and Mark knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. They had to take the fight to Moore. But to do that, they needed a plan. Rachel contacted them regularly, keeping them updated on the situation. Moore's influence was spreading, and he had already started to retaliate, threatening those who were involved in bringing him down. The danger was far from over, but with each new piece of evidence that came to light, Emily and Mark's resolve only grew stronger. The days seemed to stretch on in the quiet safety of the house. Mark and Emily spent their time strategizing, trying to come up with their next move. They had made significant progress. Moore's corruption was out in the open, his criminal network starting to unravel. But they knew that without proper evidence, Moore could still slither his way out of justice. As the media coverage continued, the pressure mounted, and Moore's efforts to discredit them grew more aggressive. Emily could almost feel his reach, his influence suffocating her from all directions. But in this calm, temporary shelter, they had a rare opportunity to plan their next step. They were no longer just exposing the truth. They had to make sure Moore couldn't cover his tracks or silence anyone who might try to testify against him. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. Rachel had been sending updates regularly, and the investigation into Moore was gaining speed. Law enforcement agencies from other districts were now involved, but Moore's supporters were deeply entrenched in the system. It wasn't enough to just expose the truth. They needed to make sure Moore was brought to justice. It was late afternoon when Mark received a message on his phone. It was from Rachel. "The meeting is set. I've got a lead on someone who worked with Moore closely, someone who knows everything. They're ready to talk, but they want protection. You'll need to move fast." Mark's eyes locked onto the message. "This could be the break we need," he muttered, his voice filled with urgency. Emily was by his side in an instant. "Who is it?" "A former associate of Moore's. Someone who worked as an intermediary between Moore and his criminal network. They've been keeping a low profile, but now they're ready to talk. They want to meet tonight." Emily stood up, her heart hammering in her chest. "Where?" Rachel's message came through just moments later. "Meet at the old train station, 10 p.m. Be careful. They're scared." Emily and Mark exchanged a glance. They knew the risks. Anyone close to Moore would have eyes on them, and someone who had been in the criminal underworld would be a potential target. But they didn't have a choice. This was their chance to get Moore. They couldn't afford to hesitate. As the evening descended, they prepared for what could be the most dangerous meeting of their lives. Emily packed a small bag, just in case things went sideways. Mark checked his phone again, making sure the coordinates were still accurate. They weren't sure how much time they had, but they knew they had to move fast. The station was just on the outskirts of the city, a quiet, forgotten place where few ventured anymore. The drive to the station was filled with silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Emily knew they were walking into a potential trap. Moore had already shown that he would stop at nothing to protect his empire, and anyone connected to him was a potential target. But they had to keep moving forward. The moment they stopped, Moore would win. When they arrived at the station, they parked some distance away, making sure to remain out of sight. The area was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of rust and old machinery. It felt deserted, eerie, like a place where secrets were buried and left to rot. They made their way through the abandoned station, their steps echoing in the quiet. Mark led the way, his eyes scanning the shadows. They approached the meeting spot, a small, secluded alcove near the edge of the platform. The train tracks were quiet, the stillness of the night almost unnerving. At exactly 10 p.m., they saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man, wearing a long coat, his face obscured by a hat. He approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder before stopping in front of them. "You must be Mark and Emily," the man said, his voice low and raspy. "I'm glad you came." Mark nodded, his voice steady but wary. "You're the one who has information on Moore?" The man hesitated, looking around nervously before answering. "Yes. I worked with him for years. I knew the people he was involved with, the deals he made. But I didn't know the full extent of his corruption until it was too late. Now, I can't live with it anymore." Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. "We need everything you know. We're going after Moore. We have the evidence to bring him down, but we need you to help us expose him for good." The man shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the shadows again. "I want to help, but you don't understand. Moore is powerful. He has people everywhere. If I talk, I'm a dead man." Mark's eyes narrowed. "If you don't talk, you're already as good as dead. Moore won't let you live if he knows you're involved. He'll come after you either way." The man took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "All right, I'll talk, but not here. Not tonight." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? You agreed to meet now. You said you were ready." The man's eyes were wild with fear. "If Moore finds out I'm talking to you, he'll have me killed before I get out of here. We need to meet in a safer location. I have a recording, proof of his ties to the criminal world. It's the key to taking him down, but I can't risk handing it over like this. We need to move." Mark stepped closer, his voice quiet but insistent. "Where do we go?" The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be calculating the risk, but then, after a tense pause, he spoke. "Follow me," he said. Without waiting for them to respond, he turned and walked away quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the station. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, and without a word, they followed. Every instinct told them to be cautious, but they had no choice. This could be their only chance to bring Moore down for good. The man led them down a narrow path, hidden behind the decaying buildings of the station. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the noise of distant trains, and they found themselves in a secluded alley behind the station. The man stopped abruptly in front of an old, rusted van, its windows tinted. "Get in," the man instructed. Mark exchanged a look with Emily, then nodded. They had no choice. They needed this information, and they had to trust that the man wasn't leading them into a trap. They climbed into the van, and the man quickly drove off, taking them out of the city and into the outskirts. The darkness of the night wrapped around them as they left the safety of the station behind. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But for the first time in a long while, she was starting to feel like they were closer to the end of this nightmare. They just didn't know yet how much farther they would have to go to bring Moore to justice. The van rumbled through the empty streets, its headlights barely cutting through the thick veil of darkness that surrounded them. The man, who still hadn't introduced himself, drove with steady hands, keeping his eyes on the road while occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror. Emily and Mark sat in the back, their hearts pounding, a sense of unease creeping up their spines. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into unknown territory, that this was a trap they hadn't fully seen coming. But Emily's unwavering determination kept him grounded. They had no choice but to trust the man. Their only chance to take down Moore was in the information he promised to provide. After a long, silent drive, the van finally slowed down. They had left the city's lights behind, the further they went into the outskirts. The van turned onto a gravel road, and the sound of tires crunching under the weight of the van seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. Emily glanced out the window but could only make out shadows, trees, tall grass, and the occasional distant silhouette of an old farmhouse. The man didn't say a word until the van came to a stop in front of an isolated, run-down cabin at the edge of a forest. The faint glow of an old, flickering porch light illuminated the place, making it look even more remote than it already was. "This is it," the man said, his voice rough. "We're here." Emily felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This had to be the place, the man's safe house, away from the eyes of Moore and his network. But she also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The man had been evasive from the start, but now that they were here, it felt more like a game of Russian roulette than a safe haven. "All right," Mark said, trying to keep his cool. "You've got our attention. What exactly is this information you've been sitting on?" The man looked over his shoulder at them. His eyes flickered with a trace of fear before he opened the door and stepped out. "I'll show you inside. You won't believe it until you see it." Mark looked at Emily, his brow furrowed. "Stay alert." The two of them followed the man into the cabin, which smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years. The floors creaked under their feet, and the walls, covered with peeling paint, seemed to be holding together only by sheer willpower. Inside, the furniture was sparse, and the faint light from an old lamp barely illuminated the dusty room. The man walked straight to a corner of the room, where an old metal box sat on a low shelf. He opened it with a click, revealing a thick stack of papers, binders, and a small recorder. "This is everything," the man said, handing the recorder to Emily. "The recordings will prove Moore's direct involvement with the criminal syndicate. The papers, well, they're a list of everything Moore has been hiding. I've seen him make deals, take money, and cover up crimes. It's all there." Emily took the recorder, her hands trembling slightly. She had always known that Moore was involved in something dark, but hearing it now from someone who had worked alongside him made the weight of the truth hit her harder than ever. She glanced at Mark, who was already rifling through the papers, looking for anything that could help build their case against Moore. "Why did you wait until now to give this to us?" Mark asked, still skeptical, his voice low. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy about the question. "I had no choice. I tried to leave the life behind, but they were watching me. Moore's men. They were everywhere. They got to my family, forced me into silence. I couldn't risk it until I knew you had the evidence you needed. I needed to make sure you were serious about taking him down. Otherwise, it would have all been for nothing." Emily's chest tightened as she processed his words. Moore's reach was longer than they had ever imagined. He didn't just have power in the department. He had people in every corner of the city, using fear and intimidation to control those who dared to stand in his way. "Your family, they're safe now, right?" Emily asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. The man nodded quickly. "For now, but I can't stay here much longer. Moore will find out I talked to you, and when he does, my life is as good as over. That's why I'm helping you, because I have nothing left to lose." Mark looked down at the papers in his hands, his mind whirring. "We have what we need," he said after a moment. This could be the key to bringing him down, but we still need more. If Moore's network is as big as we think, we can't rely on just a few pieces of evidence. We need to get this out there, fast. We need the world to see it." Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We can't stop now. We've come too far." The man looked at them both, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and hope. "Just make sure you follow through. Moore won't go down easily. He'll use everything he has to bury this. He's already started hunting down anyone who's involved. I've heard whispers that he's sending people after your friend, Rachel. She could be next." At the mention of Rachel's name, both Emily and Mark froze. They hadn't thought about the consequences of bringing Moore to the public eye. If Rachel was targeted, They couldn't risk her being silenced now. She was the only person who had been their bridge to the outside world. "We can't let that happen," Emily said, her voice tight. "We need to warn her. Now." The man nodded grimly. "You'd better hurry. Once Moore gets wind of this, he won't stop until every last one of you is gone." They didn't waste another second. Mark quickly made a call to Rachel, telling her to go into hiding immediately. Her phone rang, but she didn't answer. Panic spread through Emily's chest. Was it too late? Was she already in danger? Then the call ended with a voicemail. Mark's voice crackled as he left the message. "Rachel, you need to get out now. Moore knows. Don't trust anyone, and don't stay in one place for too long. Call us when you're safe." After hanging up, they both stood there, the weight of everything they were up against suddenly settling in. Moore was still out there, and he wasn't just a corrupt cop anymore. He was a monster, willing to destroy anyone who got in his way. "We need to get this to the press. We need to move quickly," Mark said, his eyes dark with resolve. But Emily wasn't so sure anymore. Her mind kept going back to Rachel. What if they were already too late? What if the worst had already happened? And, in the silence that followed, Emily realized that the fight wasn't just about Moore anymore. It was about survival. The stakes had just escalated beyond what they had ever imagined. The hours that followed felt like a blur, with time slipping away faster than Emily and Mark could grasp it. They had a plan. They would get the evidence into the hands of the media, make sure Rachel got the story out, and protect themselves while doing it. But every minute spent waiting for the world to see the truth felt like an eternity. Moore's reach was vast, and the fear that his people were closing in on them loomed over them like a dark cloud. Mark's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Rachel. "I'm on the move. Not sure how long I have. I'll make sure the story gets out. I'll keep you updated." Emily exhaled, relief washing over her. For now, Rachel was safe. But she couldn't shake the nagging fear that it wouldn't be long before Moore caught up with her. She had to trust Rachel, though. Rachel had been a constant ally in this fight, and the only reason they had been able to expose Moore's crimes in the first place. If Rachel was going to publish this, she needed to be safe. Mark handed Emily the recorder and the papers, the physical evidence they had fought so hard for. "It's all here. The world needs to see it. We need to make sure this doesn't get buried." They had spent days talking about this moment. They had always known that exposing Moore would put them at the center of a massive storm, but they hadn't realized just how dangerous the storm would be. They were no longer just fighting for justice, they were fighting to survive. Moore wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was the face of everything that had been wrong with the system. His connections ran deep, and Emily knew that exposing him would turn everything upside down. But it was the only way forward. As they prepared to leave the cabin, they heard the faint sound of a car engine in the distance. Mark's head snapped toward the window, his instincts kicking in. "Stay low," he whispered urgently, stepping in front of Emily. They crouched behind the old furniture, the tension thick in the air. The car slowed down, stopping just outside the cabin. Emily's heart raced. She knew this was it. Moore's men had found them. The door to the cabin creaked open, and footsteps sounded on the porch. The shadows of two men loomed through the frosted glass of the window. They were coming in. Mark reached for his phone, tapping out a message to Rachel. "They're here. Get the story out. Now. We're not going to make it out of this." He sent the message and pocketed his phone. The sound of footsteps drew closer, the air thick with the possibility of danger. They had no time left. Emily swallowed hard, her voice shaking but determined. "We can't go down without a fight. Let's make sure Moore doesn't win." "Not this time." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll make sure the truth gets out. We'll fight until the end." The door to the cabin burst open. Two men, dressed in dark clothes, stepped inside. They looked around the room, scanning it for any signs of movement. Their eyes narrowed as they took in the empty space, the absence of anyone in the obvious hiding spots. Mark and Emily stayed completely still, not daring to make a sound. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running down his cheek, moved toward the back of the cabin. Emily's breath caught in her throat. They were getting closer. "You think they're here?" the other man asked in a low voice. "I don't know," the scarred man replied. "But they were just here. Keep looking." The men moved cautiously, their eyes sweeping the room as they moved deeper into the cabin. Mark's hand gripped his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency button. But before he could make a move, the scarred man turned to face the other. "I don't see anyone. They must have left." Emily exhaled, relief flooding through her. They had escaped detection, for now, but there was no guarantee they were safe. The men turned and walked back toward the door, muttering to each other about the next steps. As the door closed behind them, Mark and Emily slowly stood up, their bodies tense with adrenaline. "We have to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaky. "They won't stop looking for us." Mark nodded. "We go now. Rachel's counting on us." They grabbed the evidence, making sure not to leave anything behind. They couldn't risk it. If Moore found this, everything they had worked for would be destroyed. They moved quickly, silently, out of the cabin, keeping low to the ground. They didn't look back. They had one goal now: get the truth out to the world. Make sure Moore was brought to justice. Hours later, back in the city, the news spread like wildfire. The story was everywhere, on television, social media, and news sites. Rachel had come through. The recordings, the documents, everything Emily and Mark had fought for was out in the open. The world now knew the truth about Chief Robert Moore. But the victory came with a price. Emily and Mark watched as the footage aired on the news, their faces now as much a part of the story as Moore's. They had succeeded in exposing the corruption that had plagued the city for years, but Moore's retaliation was only just beginning. The police department had already begun to launch an internal investigation, and Moore's supporters were trying to discredit the evidence. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth had been unleashed, and it couldn't be put back in the shadows. For Emily and Mark, the fight wasn't over. But it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about keeping the fight alive. They would continue to fight for the people who had been wronged, for the truth that had been buried for too long. And as the first of many arrests were made, and the world began to realize just how deep Moore's corruption ran, Emily and Mark knew one thing for sure. They had changed everything. As the sun began to rise over the city, Emily stood by the window, looking out over the skyline. She knew the road ahead would be hard, and Moore's reach would continue to haunt them for a while. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. They had won. The truth had won. And that, at least, was enough.